Hi guys, Devin from Sugar Cat Cookies here. I'm going to take you through my decorating process for these 7 Easter egg tile cookies. I did some line work and some wet on wet, and I'm going to talk about how I decorated them. So for this cookie, I'm doing a blue flood, and then I'm going to do some details on top. I'm using an outline consistency to go around the outside of the egg and then filling it in with a flood. This is about a 10 to 15 second flood. So I always use my scribe to go around the edges and make sure that that icing is pulled out over that outline to make sure we have a nice seamless edge, and then popping any bubbles and fixing any little bumpy spots. So once that's dry, I'm going to go and add some details. And I'm using my detail consistency again here to outline some stripes. I'm giving each stripe a little bit of a curve to mimic the curve of an egg, so it's not just going straight across, and really getting in there with my scribe and making sure that that icing is settled in there so we don't get any craters. This is a flood consistency. I would normally use a bit of a thicker hybrid, but since I was doing some wet on wet on the other cookies, I wanted it to be a little thinner. So I'm carefully mixing that in well with my scribe to make sure there's no air pockets so that it's settled well onto the cookie. I'm doing the same thing here with another thick pink band, and then adding some gold smaller bands in between. Now when I'm doing stripes like this, I often start with a middle stripe and then build out from that so that I know that it's going to be relatively even. If I started at the top and just went all the way straight down, the stripes might be a little bit inconsistent in their distance from each other. And now I'm just adding some little dots in here with the detail consistency, anchoring my icing there and then pulling across and adding a few more dots. And there's my cookie. Now for this cookie, I did a little bit more detailed decoration once I was done flooding, but I started out the same way with outline consistency and then filling with a flood consistency. Now I usually flood right up against the edge of that detail outline, and I like to do it right away so that the detail doesn't have much time to dry. Because when I go around with my scribe and pull it out and smooth out all those bumps, I want it to kind of blend into that outline so we don't get that separation where the outline looks like it's standing out from the flood. So again here I'm going and using a detail outline consistency for my shapes. And then again, detail for my dots. Now for all these cookies, you'll notice I'm not using a projector. I did draw up my designs beforehand, and I'm just using my iPad. I have my designs up on my screen while I'm decorating, and I'm just using it for reference and then just freehanding. So for these short little lines, when I'm doing a design again like this across, again, I'll start with the little triangle in the middle and then do the sides, because if I started on one side and went across, I might get a kind of a half-made triangle once I got to the other side, if that makes sense. Now again, I just touch down and anchor my line before I start pulling across. Release pressure and gently set down on the other side. So there's that middle triangle that kind of sets up the symmetry of the pattern. And then I put 2 there and 2 on the other side. Now filling in these little triangles, and I'll go in with my scribe again and mix all these very carefully and just even out the size of the triangles and make sure that they're nice and pointed and that there's no spots where the outline is looks separated from the flood. Now for this one, I kind of deviated from my original drawing and I did it a little different than I planned to, but I think it ended up looking okay. It's a little bit asymmetrical. You'll see one side looks a bit different than the other, but once the egg is done, no one is really going to notice that. In these smaller triangles, it's especially important to get in and mix with the scribe. You'll actually see when I'm done this, if you look carefully, I do have one tiny crater on the right side, but it's pretty much impossible to avoid craters all the time. All we can do is our best to make sure that icing is settled down in there. Every now and then a crater happens, but it's still a really pretty cookie. So for these tiny lines here, I couldn't get right up to the edge of that pink line or without going over top of it just because of the angle of my hand. So I decided to just pull them and have them just touch and lay on top of that pink line a bit. And as long as they're all the same, it's going to look really pretty. Now adding some more dots. I added a lot of dots to these cookies. I didn't really know when to stop, so. And there's some more dots. There we go. You can see that one tiny crater in there on the bottom. So this is a wet on wet cookie. I love doing this type of design. I think it's so pretty. So what I did was kind of outline all these little section wavy shapes first, and then I'm going to go in and flood them one after the other so that the flood doesn't have time to dry because we want it to be a nice even wet on wet where they're coming up against each other. Now what I could have done for this cookie is outline all the way around the edge first and then put my lines across in each color, or even just use white, and the outline would have been pretty much covered up once I flood it, but I kind of like doing it this way too to practice getting that even line even though I'm using a bunch of different icings. So now I'm starting to flood and using my scribe to pull out the edges, and when I do the wet on wet line I do it immediately after with the next color and really use quite a bit of pressure as you come up against the side of the next icing. If you don't put enough pressure there, sometimes you'll get a little ditch it can dry a little bit indented. So you want to use quite a bit of pressure with each icing up against each other to really fill in any little cracks in there. Now, this is sped up 3 times. I'm not actually working quite this fast. I'm going very slow with all of these cookies. I think that's really the key to getting very clean line work when you're working with designs like this where you want everything very crisp and clean. And again, using that scribe to try to make the edges very blended into each other so it looks nice and rounded. Now once this is dry, I just went and added a little line of each color to give it a little bit of texture. Just touching down and anchoring each line, pulling it across, and then almost wrapping it a little bit around the corner so that it isn't a sort of a sudden edge. It's kind of curved around a little bit. Moving on to another detailed line work and dot cookie. For this pink one, I'm using a light pink flood. And again, this is about a 10 to 15 second flood, more like a 10 actually. I often use more of a hybrid for flooding, but since I was doing wet on wet and I wanted this cookie to have this flood to settle very quickly and nicely, I used more of a traditional flood for these. But it does mean there is more of a risk of craters. So you'll notice for all these cookies, I'm using curved lines. I think it gives it a little more interest than just going straight across. Kind of mimics the curved shape of the egg. This one was kind of just like a freestyle, doing a bunch of different lines and colors for fun. So touching down, pulling that across again and kind of curving it around, and then I did these little zigzags here. You can see this yellow outline is getting a bit soft, whereas that white and blue is a little more crisp. It's okay for this application, but if I was doing anything where I wanted a really, really clean line, I would probably have rebagged that and mixed it with a little icing sugar to make it a little thicker again. I live in a very humid climate, so my icing often gets a little bit watery and I have to rebag it if I'm working for too long and it's humid out. So adding some dots here and more dots. There's so many dots on these cookies. I realized when I was finished it's almost too many, but It's okay. And then these last white lines here. And there we go. Now this is a very simple cookie in concept, but I think it looks super impressive, and I really have fun doing cookies like this that has lots of lines in it. So I'm flooding this with a gold color, same as the others, just your standard flood. And then using my scribe to make sure all those edges are nice and pulling the icing a little bit out if there's any spots that are bumpy. And then letting this dry. Now when I'm doing lines like this, as I mentioned before, I start in the middle, and then you can see I'm cutting each side in half into quarters, really, to make sure that it's nice and even. And then in each quarter, I put a line. So starting in the middle, going to the sides, and then cutting those sections in half again to make sure that it's pretty even. And I'm doing the same horizontally, middle, top, bottom, and then those 4 sections I cut in half as close to the middle as I can again to try to get it pretty even. You can see on the top there that top second section is a little bigger, but no one's going to notice when it's done. And then I went and added some dots in alternating colors across here. Tiny ones at the top and even tinier at the bottom. I think it looks really pretty. Now this one is a lot of fun. This is a wet on wet, wet on wet. This is a really classic technique, but it's never gets old. It's just so much fun to do and it looks so cool. So I'm flooding this with pink, and then before it dries, I'm going to do some wet on wet details, getting that nice and smooth with my scribe. And then I'm using my flood to just put some colored lines across here on a slight curve to mimic that curve of the egg. All of these lines are flood consistency. So adding some white and then my yellow. Trying to keep it roughly even, but it doesn't have to be perfect. And then just pulling my scribe straight through. Same idea as with the last cookie and going in the middle and then the sides, trying to keep it even. And then going the opposite direction to create this cool wet on wet design. And then just taking my scribe and making that bottom nice and smooth so it still looks nice and round like an egg. And I think it's super impressive when it's done. This is a little bit of an experimental egg. I didn't really know what was going to happen with it. It was more just playing around. I think it actually turned out kind of cool. So I flooded the top with white. And then I started to put just some flood consistency swirls in here. I was going to try to just make these into some little swirls with my scribe, but I got a little bit carried away, as you can see. They didn't look as impressive as I thought, so I just started mixing them all up. And once I'd committed to that, I couldn't really stop, so I kept going. And then I added a little more color on the sides so that the sides weren't just white. And kept going until I got kind of this cool marbly effect that actually ended up being really pretty. A little bit weird. Not what I expected, but kind of cool. So then on the bottom, I just did a solid blue and let it dry and then did some details on top. So I took my dark pink and just made a band right in the middle, pushing that flood consistency in there and mixing it really well. And then some more line work, touching down and pulling those lines down to a little curve. Again, middle, sides, and then cutting those sections in half again. and then just a few dots for texture. And that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and let me know if you're interested in seeing more videos like this.